Peace, love, and light, beautiful people. It's your girl, Morgan Renee Myers, tuning in with another reading. Today, and until we're done with this book, we'll be reading For Freedom's Sake, The Life of Fannie Lou Hamer by Chana Lee. And I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I had started to read Black Faces, White Mask by Fannie. I was having a super difficult time getting through it. So that's something that I need to study and read on my own before I try to present that live again. To be honest, I'm not presenting it live again. We done with Fannie's Blackface White Mask. I gotta understand French more. It was just a lot. But Fannie Lou Hamer, a lot of us don't know about her. A lot of us did not read about her in the education system growing up. Hey, Zanita Glover, girl. But yeah, I was off the grid this weekend, y'all. Honey, I needed it. Since probably August, I've been watching toddlers throughout the week, 2 of them. I've been watching one since about August of last year, and even prior to that, he liked family. And the other one since COVID hit and her mother's job situation changed. And so auntie needed some time off, honey. So I took the whole weekend and just had a little getaway. Was unplugged, wasn't on my technology, and it felt good. But I'm happy to be back. Well, not happy, but I'm back here and there. But I'm definitely make sure I'm self-caring. And so y'all know reading and educating is one of my facets and paths to just realization of what I like to do. And, hopefully you learn something. So I'm going to just hop right into it. Now, I like to read the preface and the intro and all of that. So we're going to do that. So it helps give you a background of what's about to be talked about. Or just give you a little more in-depth details of maybe some of the background and historical information of the life of Fannie. So let's go. Preface. For Freedom's Sake, The Life of Fannie Lou Hamer by Chana Lee. Biographies of the poor make generous offerings. They teach us just as much about the empowered as they do about the dispossessed and disenfranchised. Life histories of the privileged are rarely as kind. Invariably, a humbling possibility grabs our attention. On some abstract symbolic level, oppressed individuals ultimately can so reclaim value and garner just rewards from their heroic battles against devaluation and exclusion. After all, it was what they have done and said during the fight that warrants our writing about them. In this sense and others, the meaning and consequences of a poor person's life stretch far beyond the scope of that life and far beyond the limits that others had set for it. It makes sense then that a poor woman's story, a poor black Southern woman's story, could speak so thoroughly to the central theme of American history, the fight for political and economic freedom. This is such a story. It is one account of the life and times of the civil rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer. It is at once the story of a major social protest movement and of a remarkably dedicated black woman from the Mississippi Delta, the last of 20 born children into a sharecropping family. Good Lord. Hamer drew strength and inspiration from poverty and racism and went on to become one of the most respected leaders of her day. Early influences on Hamer's character were everlasting. A bold and attentive mother shaped Hamer's understanding of race, class, work, and sex in the South. Though through her mother's words and actions, Hamer came to appreciate the individual power that flowed from clever, self-affirming responses to injustice. Psychologically, she had to. For vulnerability was an onerous reality for black girls and women in the Jim Crow South. Unquestionably, Hamer's identity was also shaped by sexualized racial violence. Her grandmother's rape, which Hamer learned of as a girl, and the involuntary sterilization and sexual molestation that Hamer experienced as an adult. These experiences took up meaningful space in her inner life. The agony and anger were constant. In addition, beginning as early as age 6, Hamer led a hard, uncertain existence as an exploited sharecropper. For much of her life, deprivation defined her material existence. The summer of 1962 marked her formal entry into the civil rights movement. Arrests, bombings, and job dismissals followed, but Hamer continued working as a field secretary with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, throughout the early 60s. She conducted door-to-door canvassing and taught citizenship classes through the rural South. As a dynamic speaker and moving singer, Hamer also contributed significantly to the organization's fundraising. Through her work with SNCC and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, or the MFDP, an organization she co-founded, Hamer helped bring thousands of blacks into an institutionalized political process, an important step in African Americans' quest for improving life chances. Among her many contributions, Hamer is remembered most for the stand she made at the 1964 Democratic National Convention in New Jersey. There, Hamer, and y'all should, I remember I went and YouTube this. Y'all should YouTube this so you can see the speech. There, Hamer led an MFDP challenge to unseat the all-white Mississippi delegation. The highlight of the convention came when Hamer delivered a passionate account of the 1963 police beating in Winona, Mississippi that left her partially blind. It was at this point that Hamer rose to national prominence. Y'all YouTube that. That's, wow. Beginning in 1965, Hamer began concentrating her efforts on economic self-reliance through the Mississippi Freedom Labor Union, Head Start programs, and the Freedom Farm Corporation, a cooperative venture she established to feed, clothe, and house Mississippi's poor. In many ways, the building of the corporation was largely a one-woman effort. Hamer traveled thousands of miles to raise funds for the farm, making numerous speeches and conducting intensive letter-writing campaigns. Thousands of people were fed and clothed in Sunflower County, and similar projects sprang up in surrounding areas. Throughout the 1970s, Hamer combined all of her strategies for change. She ran for office, participated in party conventions, boycotted stores, initiated school desegregation lawsuits, and spoke out on the lead issues of her time, from the Vietnam War to abortion. Accounting for her actions and reactions, both political and personal, demands recognition of the shifting social context of Hamer's life. These contexts gain meaning from the general configuration of race, sex, and class hierarchies of Hamer's time and place, and from the relative positioning of Hamer in her various social settings. As a worker, Hamer spent most of her adult life as the destitute farmer charged with supervising others and keeping records for the plantation. In her marriage, Hamer was a take-charge woman who never allowed her civil rights activities to be circumscribed by the demands of family and marriage, a fact that she kept private, apparently because of her conflicting feelings concerning what participation in the movement meant for her marriage. In her public life, Hamer was the outspoken, indignant grassroots leader who was highly respected and sometimes even feared. Most people in the civil rights movement respected her leadership, largely because in her public persona, she was the quintessential victim of racism and poverty who chose to stand tall and unbroken in the face of ever-present defeat. Yet, it was the same position that was partly responsible. Let me turn my phone on vibrate. Okay. Most people I lost my spot. Okay. Quintessential victim of racism and poverty who chose to stand tall and unbroken in the face of ever-present defeat. Yet it was this same position that was partly responsible for keeping her outside the circle of mainstream middle-class, more respectable civil rights leaders, many of whom regarded her plain-spoken, abrasive manner as too much of an embarrassment in the real world of politics. Combined, these roles represented a curious sort of status for Hamer, the wife, mother, farm worker, and political activist. They created a duality of being that, on one hand, allowed her much leverage and influence, but on the other hand, often left her angry, unfulfilling, wanting, and confused. As a plantation timekeeper, grassroots leader, and self-directed mother and wife, Hamer assumed positions that became their own sources of authority for her, sources that occasionally allow her small doses of agency in her political and private worlds. Hold on, I thought she never became a mother. We'll read about that and see. Although personal tragedy and political disappointment were constant, Hamer's life is not a story of complete victimization or defeat. Neither is it an example of complete triumph over all odds. The impact of her experiences falls somewhere in between. Her civil rights struggles brought many rewards, but they also resulted in enormous personal pain, disappointment, and exhaustion. In the end, after movement activity had waned and the national attention had discovered a new focus, she was left virtually alone to assess the consequences of her sacrifices made in the quest for freedom. This book is as much about the collective journey as about the personal cost. Hamer was just one of a number of black women leaders in the civil rights movement. Black women played pivotal roles in every significant stage of the movement. It was Daisy Bates who led the 1957 challenge to desegregate the all-white Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. Septima Clark, a longtime educator, engineered the first citizenship schools, which encouraged and trained local leaders throughout the South. Moreover, had it not been for Ella Baker, a veteran activist, the youthful energy of the movement might never have found the effective organizational base that SNCC provided. Black women afforded the civil rights movement a style of leadership that contributed greatly to its success, and it was the destitute sharecropper, Fannie Lou Hamer, who rose up and gave this style of leadership its broadest appeal. Through her leadership, Fannie Lou Hamer represented a necessary left-wing tendency within the civil rights movement. She functioned as both symbol and worker. She was truly one of those well-respected individuals in the movement who walked others through rough times by mere example and by actual hands-on help. To many, she was one of those mamas in the movement. According to Charles Sherrod, a SNCC member, the mamas were usually the militant women in the community, outspoken, understanding, and willing to catch hell, having already caught their share. This study is an effort to document the life experience of one of those women, a woman whose share of hell was undeniably convincing testament to the power of human spirit. All right, so that was the preference. Now they got some acknowledgments, which I'm going to skip over. And we're going to get into it for freedom's sake. Chapter 1 is called Delta Daughter. It starts off with a quote from a song by Billie Holiday. I ain't good looking and my hair ain't curls. I ain't good looking and my hair ain't curls. But my mother give me something that's going to carry me through this world. Delta Daughter. Fannie Lou Hamer's path to civil rights leadership was not inevitable or preordained, but perhaps nothing could have put her more effectively on a direct path to political activism than her own agonizing childhood. Hamer's involvement in the civil rights cause was more than a function of generic identification with the collective suffering of her class, race, and sex. What seemed an insurmountable combination of poverty and racism to many sharecropping families was, for Hamer, an inspiration to relentless effort. Hamer was born Fannie Lou Townsend on October 6, 1917 in Montgomery County, Mississippi. She was the child of two sharecroppers, James Lee and Luella Bromlett Townsend, both well up in age at the time of Fannie Lou's birth. The Townsend family already included 14 boys and 5 girls. In addition to sharecropping all their lives, James Lee and Luella had other responsibilities. According to Hamer, her father worked as a Baptist preacher and a bootlegger in the community with her mother. Like most black women sharecroppers, According to Hamer, her father worked as a Baptist preacher and bootlegger in the community, while her mother, like most black women sharecroppers, also labored in white homes as a domestic servant. Both Luella and James Townsend were natives of Mississippi, as were her parents and his father. James Lee's mother was born in South Carolina. The Townsends married on September 4th, 1891 in Choctaw County, Mississippi, and sometime between 1891 and 1910, they moved to Montgomery County, where they stayed for a time with James's brother Ben Townsend. Subsequently, while thousands of black families made that great migration out of the rural South, settling first in southern urban areas and ending up in the Northeast and Midwest, the Townsends relocated to nearby Sunflower County, 60 miles west of Montgomery, on E.W. Brandon's Ruleville plantation. Fannie Lou was 2 years old at the time. In her autobiographical accounts, Hamer frequently depicted her parents as self-sacrificing and resourceful. Her recollections accented the full extent of her parents' effort to provide for the Townsend family. In the case of her father, Hamer seemed to see no contradiction in his being a man of the cloth and of the spirits. She never spoke publicly about his bootlegging in a critical way. It was indeed almost a source of pride. James Lee was simply doing what needed to be done to help the family to survive, and after his death, Hamer took over the bootlegging operation for a brief time. In this regard, Hamer's thinking and living, like that of her parents, were guided by a moral economy that blended a Christian worldview with Southern realism. One did what one needed to do in order to survive within the limits of one's own value system. For the Townsends and other sharecroppers in predominantly black Sunflower County, hard work, poverty, exploitation, and violence were stark realities. Sharecropping, a postbellum system designed to replace slavery as a cheap source of labor, was the lowest rung on the ladder of Farm, Tennessee. Sharecroppers worked in the science section of plantation land. The landlord provided tenants with housing, food, seed, fertilizer, and farm equipment from the plantation owner's company store, usually at outrageously high interest rates, and took half or more of the crop. Located in the heart of that cotton-rich, fertile flatland between the Yazoo and Mississippi rivers, commonly referred to as the Delta, Sunflower County was the home of the rulers and poorest of the poorest. In Fannie Lou Hamer's words, such a characterization captures the harshness of life for the Townsends and their neighbors during the 1920s and 1930s. Workers' wages averaged anywhere from $1.25 to $3 a day. Hamer recalled times when her mother worked for as little as 25 and 30 cents a day. Many black families during this period subsisted on as little as $300 a year, struggling against widespread disease, poor or non-existent education, inadequate medical care, and malnutrition. Political disenfranchisement of African Americans and the social indignities of Jim Crow made matters even more hopeless for Afro-Mississippians. Children experienced such conditions in immediate ways. Hamer recalled that her childhood was worse than hard. Although the Townsends made 50 to 60 and sometimes as many as 70 bales of cotton a year, they still had difficulty surviving, a fact that they were constantly reminded of during meals. Dinner often consisted of unseasoned green and flour gravy. At other times, the family had only bread and onions. According to Hamer, it was horrible. There was never enough food to satisfy her hunger. Sometimes that food was little more than maybe, say, some cornmeal and an onion cut up with some salt on it. In her memories, which were probably nearly as painful as the actual experiences, Hamer was also careful to juxtapose deprivation against what she perceived to be elements of privilege in her own very limited environment. In her autobiography, Hamer told of recurrent dreams of relieving hunger with a piece of cornbread or the Townsend family special Christmas treat, oranges and apples. Adequate clothing was hard to come by as well. Hamer, who claimed that she was a big girl before she received her first pair of shoes, remembered that Mama tried to keep our feet warm by wrapping them in rags and tying them with a string. At the age of 6, Fannie Lou joined her brothers and sisters on the plantation, chopping cotton 12 to 14 hours each day from the proverbial can see to can't see. Her lifelong work in the cotton fields began when a conniving plantation owner encouraged her to try her hand at picking cotton, an experience that was probably her first direct encounter with the unjust order of the American South. Hamer told this particular story often, emphasizing the deceptive landowner's gesture as a trick, an example of fate and treachery. One day, while Fannie Lou was out playing by a gravel road near her family's home, a patched tin-roof wooden shack, the plantation owner drove up and asked if she could pick cotton. The youngest Townsend child responded honestly by saying she did not know. The owner suggested in a most optimistic and encouraging tone that she could. He then piqued her interest by offering the child a reward of sardines, a quarter-pound of cheese, some Cracker Jack, and a gingerbread cookie called a Daddy Wide Legs, all in exchange for picking 30 pounds of cotton in a week. With this promise in mind and the ever-present hunger pains in her stomach, Fannie Lou rushed out onto the field and told her mother and father about her conversation with the landowner. Her parents did not discourage her. Instead, they told her that she would have to pick her own cotton for the goodies promised by the owner. They would not give her the 30 pounds that they had worked for. With the eagerness of a naive 6-year-old, Fannie Lou strapped on a cloth flour sack and began filling it up with cotton as fast as she could. At the end of the week, she had given it her best effort and successfully completed the task by picking 30 pounds. Fannie Lou was taken to the store and given each item the landowner had promised. With hunger so often on her mind, she enjoyed the treat so much that she later recalled never stopping to think that now she would be expected to work every day. By the end of the second week, she had graduated to a larger croaker or grass sack and doubled her efforts by collecting 60 pounds of Mississippi precious fiber. But this time, how's she 6 years old carrying 60 pounds of cotton? That sounds difficult. But this time, there were no rewards. There was not even comparable pay for comparable work performed, if there was such a thing under sharecropping. 7 years later, at the age of 13, the teenage Fannie Lou Hamer found herself picking as much as 200 to 400 pounds of cotton a day, for which she would receive only $1. In 1968, before an astonished and admiring church congregation in Ohio, Fannie Lou Hamer sized up her cotton-picking prowess by remarking, "It had become like an art. Like some of her peers, Hamer developed a love-hate relationship with the crop. Even though it came to symbolize her suffering, her individual yield was also a source of pride. It was not until she became an adult that Fannie Lou realized that she had been exploited. In a 1965 interview, she recalled of her initiation into work field. So I picked the 30 pounds of cotton that week, but I found out what actually happened was he was trapping me into beginning the work I was to keep doing, and I never did get out of his debt again. Hamer's experience was elements of tragedy, of superhuman strength and stamina, and of childhood and racial vulnerability occasioned by deprivation and longing. In her account, Hamer made little reference to less dramatic, more practical issues that might help explain why she entered the field so early, such as her family's need for additional labor. Nonetheless, this story has become a central feature of the Fannie Lou Hamer lore. It provides evidence that her childhood experiences and memories were central to her later political commitments. Hard work was becoming a constant in young Fannie Lou Townsend's life, and as she picked 200 to 300 pounds per day alongside family members. They all labored incessantly in the burning sun as the wealthy landowner watched from his porch in comfort. In recalling the increased work demand during land clearing time, Hamer often described cutting stalks like men. Just before beginning her stint as a field worker, Fannie Lou had a frightening bout with polio, which left her with a limp that plagued her for the rest of her life. A limp that did not, however, keep her from the fields. Physically challenged or not, Fannie Lou kept returning to the fields, tagging along with her parents and siblings, dragging behind her a cloth bag nearly as large as she was. For the Townsend family, life was not always a cycle of work and starvation. When there was recreation or rest time, the family usually spent it roasting peanuts and laughing at their father's jokes to the point of pain. When bedtime rolled around, the family crawled into beds that rattled like flaps of paper because they were made of dry grass and corn shucks. Okay. This chapter's kind of long. I'm about to wrap it up in a second. Let's see. Okay. So yeah, I'm finished. Okay. So, when there was recreation or rest time, the family usually spent it roasting peanuts and laughing at their father's jokes to the point of pain. When bedtime rolled around, the family crawled into beds that rattled like flaps of paper because they were made of dry grass and corn shucks. Because of the long, hard hours that Fannie Lou Townsend spent in the fields, she generally attended school after the harvest was completed, which meant that for her, schooling in a one-room shack on the plantation lasted only 4 months out of the year, December through March. The black school year was 3 months shorter than the average school year for whites. Such inequalities were to persist for decades in Mississippi. Another factor in the emergence of Fannie Lou Hamer was as a political activist. Because the Townsend children never had adequate clothing or shoes, the inclement weather that typically occurred during these months became yet another obstacle to receive a decent education. As if seasonal labor and bad weather were not enough, schools for young black Mississippians were segregated and woefully underfunded. The black educational experience was a cruel joke. During Fannie Lou's school-age years, approximately 1924 to 1930, school expenditure per black child averaged a little less than 20% of that for each white child in the state. Depending on the size of a country's black population, sometimes disbursements for black students were as low as 3% of white expenditures. This was the case in DeSoto County. These statistics were even more appalling when we consider the fact that the same black children constituted well over 50% of the state's school-age population. What is more, a deluge of racist propaganda in school textbooks dampened the black educational experience. As a third grader, Fannie Lou had more than one encounter with the Sambo-type character Epaminondas, a little black boy whose stupidity transcended the boundaries of human imagination and brought constant shame and danger to the adult members of his family, particularly his mother and grandmother. Gotta look that up. Epaminondas. Epaminandus. Epaminondas. Never heard of it, but I'm gonna look that up. When Fannie Lou did attend school, it was often a rewarding experience. One of her favorite teachers, Thornton Lane, made it so. Lane was a black man noted for such comical idiosyncrasies as putting his shoe on the wrong feet whenever the heels wore down, so as to, as he put it, let the heels straighten out. For the most part, Fannie Lou loved school, and it showed in her performance. She gradually developed a reputation as a skilled speller, winning a number of spelling bees. She also drew much praise from the adults in her community for her ability to recite poetry. In this regard, she heeded her mother's words of wisdom. Learn to read, because when you read, you know, and you can help yourself and others. However, economic pressures forced Fannie Lou to leave school for good at the age of 12. Later, she joined the Strangers Home Baptist Church, where she continued developing her reading skills through Bible study, a road to literacy taken by many great many slaves and ex-slaves. Okay, so we'll stop there for today. And when we come back, we'll pick up from there. So, yeah, for freedom's sake. Story about Fannie Lou Hamer. I'll check in with you guys again soon. Peace, love, and light.